Thank you, John. It's a real pleasure to be back here. I actually, it's a real unusual for me to be here in Light because when I was ages 7 to 9, I lived on the second house to the right, just across the bridge. And there weren't many neighbors there, so I wasn't allowed to play with Navy kids because there was a big fence. There was a big fence there. And so I would go down by the seashore and put about 100 snails on a piece of driftwood, send it out, and then throw rocks at it. Thinking about writing history books someday and giving a lecture here, I guess, right across the way. So, this is not my most recent book, I'm embarrassed to say. This is my most recent book. It just came out, Spies in Revolutionary Rhode Island. And maybe there's some great stories, but maybe I'll be invited back to give a lecture about that someday. But it'll be at the Newport History Gift Shop, Historical Society Gift Shop, and some other places. Now, my topic today is special operations to kidnap enemy generals during the Revolutionary War. These operations were not infrequent. George Washington himself applauded and supported such efforts undertaken by the American Army. And referring to a plan to capture British Commander-in-Chief Henry Clinton in 1778, he wrote, "I think it one of the most desirable and honorable things imagined, taking him prisoner." My story starts with Charles Lee. He was probably the most remarkable personality of the American Revolution on either side. He was brilliant but eccentric, well-educated and well-schooled in military matters, but bitingly sarcastic with his superiors. He was an Englishman, as we'll see some examples soon. He was an Englishman who was largely ignored by his mother, and his father was usually absent on duty by the British Army. His father did train and educate Lee to be a military officer, and Lee took to it. He was not an attractive man. This was said to be by his friends the best picture of him. So as you can see, he's very thin. He had a large nose. An American friend of him called him Naso. But it is one of the earliest images of a Pomeranian dog that we have. So that's kind of fun. He loved dogs. Yeah, as I said, he loved dogs, which today is very common. Back then, it was seen as eccentric. Once, when he was asked by a genteel young woman if he was fond of dogs, Lee retorted, "Yes, madam, I love dogs, but I detest bitches." That's the kind of guy he was. Now, his first military experience was in North America during the French and Indian War. He showed courage at the siege of Fort Ticonderoga by getting wounded in a charge. But he was also incredibly insulting to his superior generals. He called Major General James Abercrombie, the top general, British general, a stupid blunderer and our booby-in-chief. He was, needless to say, not making friends in the British establishment, and some called him Mad Lee. He had been promoted to lieutenant colonel, but with the downsizing of the army after the war, he was put on half pay and temporarily retired. He decided to become a soldier of fortune. He went to Poland and he got a job as a general there, so he got some experience. He began to make it clear in letters home that he was against the British monarchy and that he favored Republican government. He decided to move to America in 1770. "Liberty I adore," he explained, "and where she lives, that is my country." He was immediately hailed as a patriot leader. He wrote a popular pamphlet arguing that should the contest with Britain end in war, American militia could defeat British regulars. With the coming of the war after the Lexington and Concord, Continental Congress had to choose top generals. Of course, Washington got the top spot. Lee didn't expect that. But he wanted the second spot pretty desperately. But John Adams had other ideas. At the time, the only Continental Army was outside Boston, and it consisted mostly of New England men. So he said we should have a New England general as the number 2, and so Connecticut's Artemus Ward was selected. Lee, his response was typical. He was outraged, and he was overly harsh but accurate. He described Harvard-educated Ward as a fat old gentleman who had been a popular church warden but had no acquaintance whatever with military affairs. So within a few months, Ward agreed, and he resigned, and Lee became the number 2 guy. Now, by November 1776, the Continental Army was in dire straits. Washington had tried to defend New York City, but had failed miserably. At the Battle of Long Island on August 27, the British Commander-in-Chief, William Howe, crushed Washington's army, and then Howe easily maneuvered to capture New York City. Washington fortified Fort Washington up in the northeast of Manhattan Island. It was the last bastion. But on November 17th, Howe's army overran the fort, resulting in 2,800 prisoners, and more than half of them died in British prison ships later. Next, a few days later, Fort Lee on the Jersey side of the Hudson River, and named after Charles Lee, fell to a British force. These were some of the biggest disasters of the war for the Americans. At this time, Lee lost confidence in George Washington as commander-in-chief. Lee had not been part of the loss at Long Island. When he was back in the north, he advised against fortifying Fort Washington. Washington wasn't yet the mythical figure that he is today. And it seems that Lee made the decision that he deserved to replace Washington as the commander-in-chief. Now, after the fall of Fort Lee, a powerful British column led by Earl Cornwallis chased the remnants of Washington's army out of New Jersey, and Washington only had 3,000 troops at that time. He had left Lee with 4,000 troops at White Plains, New York, and he desperately called for Lee to meet him on the Delaware River so he could protect Philadelphia. But during what was probably the most dangerous time for the existence of Washington's army, Lee dithered and delayed. Why? Well, he was too smart to leave an obvious paper trail. It appears that Lee wanted to maintain an independent command. That's the way to one's path to glory. And if Washington's army was crushed by Cornwallis, which I think the Las Vegas odds makers, if they had been out there at that time, they would have put that at 4-1. Lee might vault to the top command of the Continental Army. Now, Lee received the first request from Washington to join him on November 22nd, but he didn't start to march his troops until November 26th. And most of his regiments didn't start marching until 2 days later, and they didn't cross the Hudson River until December 4th. So White Plains is up here, crossing at King's Ferry, and he would take a day, maybe march his troops in the afternoon, another afternoon, take a day off, another afternoon. He wasn't setting any records. Here's Morristown here, and here's Basking Ridge. In the meantime, it seemed like Cornwallis could easily cross the Delaware River and capture Philadelphia. Lee reached Morristown, New Jersey on December 8th, and his troops met him there on December 10th. Lee let his men rest an entire day, even though it was good marching weather. The next day, he had his troops headed for Bernardsville, New Jersey, and Lee and his small entourage rode at the rear of the column. Lee had to decide where to spend the night that night. He was told of Widow White's Tavern at Basking Ridge, which was 3 miles from the main encampment of his troops. Nonetheless, Lee decided to stay there with 3 aides, including 2 French volunteer officers. Lee was quite aware that Tories were in his midst. He even wrote a letter that day saying, I have to be very careful because there are Tories around, and yet he still stayed at this tavern 3 miles from his army. That was a critical mistake because, unknown to him, a party of about 38 British cavalrymen had departed Pennington, New Jersey, to ride north to obtain reconnaissance about Lee's army. Now, this party was led by Lieutenant Colonel William Harcourt, son of a British earl. There's the redoubtable Earl Harcourt, and also included Bannister Tarleton, who would become one of the most fearsome cavalrymen of the war. On the way, Loyalists informed Harcourt and Tarleton of Lee spending the night at Mary White's Tavern. They would, I won't go into the details of the raid, but you'll have to read the book for that. But I will say that my description is the most detailed and accurate in print. On December 13th, Harcourt changed his mission to reconnaissance to capturing Lee. And Tarleton's advance party gained valuable information along the way by threatening captured American soldiers with death. So they found a few sentries, threatened to hang them, and those threats, while may not be permitted today, supposedly, they did work back then. Now, reaching Basking Ridge, Harcourt's force surrounded the tavern in which Lee was staying. After a short but violent struggle with the Americans' guards, about 12 of them, they captured Lee along with one of the French officers. Then, with the American militia hunting for them, Harcourt's quick-moving raiders moved back down the roads to the safety of British-held Pennington. So this is Pennington down here. So Harcourt's raiders, went half of New Jersey almost up to Basking Ridge and then returned. Most of it in the same day. Now here's an image of the capture of Lee. You can see Lee giving up his sword. Does anyone see anything unusual with this image?
Red coat.
Red coats, exactly. Lee has a red coat, and you would think he should be wearing a blue coat because he's an American officer, while Harcourt should be wearing a red coat, but he's has a picture of him with a blue coat. But still, it's a very good image. Now, after the British raiding party left, villagers buried 2 Americans who had been cut down by Tarleton's heavy dragoons. One woman later recalled that Tarleton's dragoons had hacked them so terribly that it was found very difficult to remove their bodies to the graveyard, and they were put in boxes and interred in the field where they lay. Here's an original map that an aide to Nathaniel Greene did about 2 weeks after the raid, and he actually had he's got a dotted line showing exactly where the Harcourt's troops went. I found this in Princeton Library. Now, at the time, Lee's capture was considered a disaster for the Americans. John Trumbull Jr., the painter, Revolutionary War scenes in the future, but then a young officer, gave the view of many of his fellow officers. This is a misfortune that cannot be remedied, as we have no officer in the Army of equal experience and merit. The British viewed events typically as led by great men, and the captain of a British frigate right here in Narragansett Bay wrote, "I think the rebels cannot stand, as Lee was their chief man." But as often is the case in history, there's the law of unintended consequences. Had Lee not been captured, it seems clear that he would have tried to use his troops to capture a British outpost. But that would have been hard to do. The British were aware of his army, so they were keeping an eye out for him. So instead, what happened after Lee's capture, his army was taken over by John Sullivan, who rushed his troops to join Washington across the Delaware River. And we know what happened next. On Christmas Day, in the midst of a snowstorm, Washington and his men recrossed the Delaware and captured a large garrison of troops at Trenton. This raid altered the course of the war, giving Americans new hope. I argue that had Lee not been captured, the victory at Trenton might not have happened. Now, Americans discussed how Lee could have been captured. Some patriots wondered whether Lee was a traitor. Others blamed local Tories. By August 1781, not surprisingly, a myth arose involving sexual escapades. A French officer who was based for much of the war here in Newport visited the famous tavern at Basking Ridge to find out for himself the reason for the capture. He was informed that Lee was rather smitten by the lady of the house, and one of the lady's cousins, who was jealous of him, went underhandedly to Colonel Harcourt and informed him that the general was in the house with a small guard. That story lacks credibility. The timing doesn't work. Now, other controversies arose from Lee's capture. It was then deemed scandalous for a gentleman to appear outside without his hat and coat. It's kind of like being in here without a jacket. John Trumbull Jr. wrote to his father, "The inhuman rascals would not permit the general to take his hat and coat, but carried him off almost naked." Isn't that terrible? Even Washington complained that Harcourt's party had carried off Lee with every mark of indignity, not even suffering him to get his hat or surtout coat. However, it appears that Harcourt did allow Lee to bring his hat and coat. He just didn't allow him to put it on because he wanted to escape quickly, and the hat probably would have fell off. Now, Lee's fate as a prisoner was of intense interest in London and with the Continental Congress. The British believed that since he was a deserter and that he had taken up arms against the king, that he should be hanged. One British officer's view was typical. "I am happy to see Lee in custody, and I will be happier still to hear that he has been tried as a deserter, condemned, and hanged." And this is what happened in the last time there was a British rebellion, the Scottish Jacobite Rebellion. And this is Lord Lovat in London having his head removed. Now, at this time in the war, the British approach to treating captive American officers was not settled. The test case was Ethan Allen, the leader of Vermont's Green Mountain Boys, who had captured Fort Ticonderoga early in the war. But he had inadvisedly gone ahead of an American army invading Canada and got captured. When he was captured, he was brought before Major General Richard Prescott, who will play a big story in the book. Prescott was one of those British officers who considered rebels to be criminals. After all, weren't all traitors criminals? Prescott turned purple with rage and yelled at Allen, "I will not execute you now, but you shall grace a halter at Tyburn, goddamn ye." Allen was treated horribly as a prisoner. He was placed in dark and dank holds in British ships and fed bad food and little water. He was brought to England and placed in a common prison where he was expected he would be hanged. He caught a fever and almost died. But then an extraordinary thing happened. Allen became a cause célèbre among British supporters of the American Patriot cause. And the British authorities said, well, we don't want anything to do with this, so we'll send him back to North America. Finally, after more miserable treatment, Allen was treated as captive officers were expected to be treated. Back then, if you were an officer, and if you were captured, you were allowed to have a house in New York and live with other American officers, and you could walk around New York during the day, but at night you had to return to the house. Allen was permitted that to occur. Now, General Howe and King George III wanted Lee hanged. When Continental Congress got wind of the plan, it acted immediately, passing resolutions warning that the doctrine of retaliation would be imposed. If Lee was harmed, British captive officers held by Americans would be as well in an equivalent manner. John Adams, then a delegate to the Continental Congress, and his wife Abigail Adams exchanged letters about this subject, as they did so many others. Abigail favored a humane approach. Let them reproach us ever so much for our kindness and tenderness to those who have fallen into our hands. I hope it will never provoke us to retaliate against their cruelties. John wrote back explaining that while he admired her sentiments, retaliation we must practice, in some instances in order to make our barbarous foes respect to some degrees the rights of humanity. Now, under the threat of retaliation, Howe decided not to send Lee to the clutches of King George III, and Howe was informed that Lee had in fact resigned. So was he really a deserter? So he needed to take some time to get some legal advice in London. But he refused to treat Lee as a normal prisoner. He had Lee confined to two rooms in New York City. So Lee was not allowed to leave those 2 rooms. He was allowed to have food and wine and have some friends over, but he was not allowed free movement. In retaliation, Congress ordered that 6 officers held as captives by the Americans be confined to their rooms. And one British officer in Concord was a British aristocrat, a member of Parliament. He was held in horrid conditions in a Concord jail for a month. Now, one man in Rhode Island worried about Charles Lee, and he wanted to do something about it. He knew that Lee would never be exchanged until the Americans got an officer of an equivalent rank, Major General, as a prisoner. This man's name was William Barton. He was born in very ordinary circumstances in Warren in 1748. And as a young man, he struggled to build a small business as a hat maker in Providence. When war broke out, he joined the Rhode Island militia as a private, but his leadership skills showed through, and he rose to become a lieutenant colonel in the Rhode Island State Regiment. Barton had met Lee when Lee visited Newport in 1775, which Lee did and terrorized some Tories. And Barton thought he was a great general. Now, at the time, in June of 1777, all of Newport and the rest of Aquidneck Island was under occupation by a British army of 4,000 British, German, and Loyalist troops. In December of 1776, a powerful fleet of more than 71 ships had carried them into Narragansett Bay, and they easily captured the island. And here you can see a nice image from the early 1900s. And these are British whaleboats with redcoats streaming towards the Portsmouth coast. Now, after that, British warships patrolled in Narragansett Bay, not allowing any American ships in or out of the bay. Rhode Island and Massachusetts troops surrounded Aquidneck Island, but they were powerless to evict the British from Newport. Now, at the time, Newport was one of the 5 most important cities in the United States. Who can name the other 4? New York, Philadelphia, Boston. They're missing one. Charleston. That's it. Charleston is the one that's easily met. Charleston, Philadelphia, Boston, and New York. Newport was right there. And you'll recognize the view, a famous view. And one thing that stands out are the church steeples, because there were so many churches of various denominations in Newport. Now, on June 20th, 1777, a Mr. Coffin was escorted to Barton's headquarters in Howland's Ferry. Coffin was a civilian who had recently escaped from Aquidneck Island. He had news about Major General Richard Prescott, who had recently assumed the command of the British troops on Aquidneck Island. This was the same Prescott who had earlier abused Ethan Allen. Coffin reported that Prescott was spending nights at an isolated farmhouse about 5 miles north of Newport. Prescott previously had spent the nights at a house in the heart of Newport, at the Bannister House at Pelham Street, Spring and Pelham. Barton had an idea. He would form a small party of soldiers with experience using boats, not hard to do in Rhode Island. On a dark night, they would take boats across Narragansett Bay, avoiding the British warships stationed there. They would land unnoticed on the shores of Aquidneck Island, sneak up to the Overing House where he was staying, and surround the house. Then they would storm the house, capture General Prescott, spirit him back to the mainland, and they would have a major general to exchange for Lee. Here's an image of General Prescott. It didn't hurt that General Prescott was a hated figure in revolutionary Rhode Island. He was a classic petty tyrant. Once when he interviewed a privateer captain who had been captured by a British ship and brought to Newport, he reportedly knocked him in the head and threatened to hang him. Prescott would regularly visit a militia captain sitting in jail. His name was Burrington Anthony. He weighed about 300 pounds. He made the mistake of not leaving when the British arrived, but when they did arrive, he dressed up in his militia outfit and a sword, and he immediately was captured. Prescott would go to the jail and just harangue him and threaten to hang him for over a year, almost every day. He was known to strike Newport Quaker men with his cane for failing to doff their hats in respect as he approached. Sometimes even the British felt Prescott went too far. Previously in Canada, Prescott put out a reward of £1,000 for the capture of America's best general at the time, Benedict Arnold. Arnold, in turn, announced a reward for the capture of Prescott, but it was only half the amount, £500. So London newspapers admired Arnold for his cleverness, and Prescott looked like a fool. Now, why was Prescott spending time in a rural part of Aquidneck Island? He wanted to be closer to the action. So most of the action was up here in Howland's Ferry. Americans would send small boats raiding common fence points, some of the guard posts here. Here occasionally, Bristol Ferry, they would have presence. So that was where most of the action was. So Prescott had his headquarters here originally. Here's the Overing House, a little bit closer to the north. So he would spend the nights there. Now, Barton received permission from his superiors to gather troops and 5 whaleboats to execute his plan. And his party ultimately consisted of about 48 officers, most of whom had experience rowing whaleboats. I won't go into the details of the raid. You'll have to read the book for that. But the raid did succeed. Not only was Prescott surprised in his bed, the American grabbed an aide-de-camp, his aide-de-camp, Lieutenant William Barton, who was a nephew of the British Secretary of War, and the sole sentry standing in front of the Overing House. Funny story about the sentry, one of the participants in the raid later moved to Vermont, sent his kid to a school in Vermont, and who was the school teacher? The sentry. I found records showing that he never went back. He refused to be exchanged to go back to the British Army, so he started a new life in America. Now, I will say that Barton recognized that the weakest link in the British defense of Aquidneck Island was the west side. Prescott had troops up here, he had troops on the east side, he had troops on the south, but he didn't have any troops here. Instead, he relied on the ships in the bay. But what's the problem? This is 2 miles here and 4 miles here. So that wasn't as good protection as he thought, even though it was the naval ships. Sorry about that, guys. He thought about going from Bristol, but he would have had to come within a mile of each of these ships. So Barton decided to come from Warwick Neck. And he took his boats one dark night, using Prudence Island as a shield, cutting through the north part of Aquidneck Island, and avoiding the guard boats. That was the biggest risk he took. He landed right here, marched about a mile, crossed the West Main Road to the Overing House, which is now the Prescott Farm. Now, of course, Barton and his men were in great danger of being caught, especially by guard boats sent out by the British ships in the bay. If one musket had been fired, his whole party would have been captured. And they would have been put on British prison ships right outside here off Coastal Harbor Island. And later that summer, about 30 or 40 of the prisoners died because of the bad conditions. But Barton and his men avoided being caught. It was an incredible feat, stealing a general in the midst of the British Army and Navy without a shot being fired. Of course, the Americans were thrilled about Barton's feat. When Washington heard about it, he gushed, "This is among the finest partisan exploits that has taken place in the course of the war on either side." The Continental Congress was so pleased that it made Barton a colonel in the Continental Army, and it granted him a sword, presentation sword. Now, he didn't get the sword until 1786, but it was a beautiful sword made in France, and there were 10 others that were made at the same time. I did some research on it, which is in the book, footnotes. You got to read those footnotes sometimes. All 10 of them still exist, and some of them in museums. So it's it's a beautiful sword. Of course, the British were humiliated. A British officer in Newport, Frederick Mackenzie, he wrote a famous diary. He wrote, "It's certainly a most extraordinary circumstance that a general commanding a body of 4,000 men encamped on an island surrounded by a squadron of ships of war should be carried off from his quarters in the night by a small party of the enemy without a shot being fired." And here's a map that Mackenzie did that's in his book. And he was able to trace the path because the grass was all matted down. And right here, really very similar now to the condition back then. It's owned by the Navy, so there hasn't been much development. There has been some development here, pretty tastefully done. But a lot of, you can imagine what it was like back then, even now. Now, British newspapers focus immediately on two salacious points: Prescott's shortage of clothing when he was spirited away, and rumors of his female companionship in the Overing House. The August 19th edition of a London newspaper reported that rebel troops took him naked out of his bed, not allowing him time to put on his clothes. Another stated that Prescott had retired in the evening with his aide-de-camp and a sergeant's guard to sleep a mile from his post with a lady, but was discovered and taken by a party of the provincials at 2 o'clock in the morning. Here's a typical London newspaper. In little time, Prescott's capture became the subject of verse, song, and ribald jokes, attracting the talented breed, London's epigram writers. The Public Advertiser reported that King George III got a little upset at this. His Majesty complains of the injustice done to Prescott by the news writers. Now, this rumor of royal disfavor caused the humorist to pause for several weeks, but then the ceasefire ended on September 20 edition of the London Evening Post. It declared, "When General Prescott was taken prisoner, all he was heard to say when the provincials were bearing him on their shoulders out of the courtyard of the house was, 'Give me my breeches! Give me my breeches!'" With that, the English wits went back to work. This from the London Chronicle. "A general of late has been vilely abused, and without any reason most falsely accused. For how could a man be neglectful of duty who was taken when storming the Fortress of Beauty?" The London Chronicle capitalized on the fun. "On General Prescott being carried off naked, unanointed, unannealed. What lures there are to ruin a man. Woman, the first and foremost, all bewitches. A nymph thus spoiled the general's mighty plan, and gave him to the foe without his breeches." Eventually they got bored and moved on to another topic. But in fact, no credible evidence exists that Prescott was sleeping with Overing's wife or his daughter or any other woman. He was there to keep an eye out on the North. But it was extraordinary the freedom that English writers had to criticize their generals during wartime. Now, Washington immediately offered to exchange Prescott for Lee, but General Howe refused. He still hadn't heard from London what to do with Lee. And finally, months later, word arrived from London. The king recognized that Lee did resign, and he was aware of Congress's doctrine of retaliation, so he allowed Lee to be exchanged. The two were exchanged in April of 1778, and Lee arrived at Valley Forge in May of 1778. I then spend most of a chapter explaining how Lee returned as general second in command to Washington, how he opposed fighting the British Army because he didn't think the American Army could beat the British Army or stand on the same field. How he commanded the army at the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse and was accused of an unnecessary retreat and insulting Washington. How he was convicted of the same at a court-martial and suspended for 1 year. How the court-martial was unfair, but it unintentionally got it right because Lee really didn't have confidence in the American Army, and he had been a traitor. Here's a good image done by an American officer. It says, "The suspended general." So he's in a boot, and he does have a large proboscis, as you can see. So. Now, sadly, Lee died in disgrace in a Philadelphia tavern in 1782. By contrast, Rhode Island's William Barton would live for many years, and he gained a tremendous reputation for the capture of General Prescott. After the war, Barton became a member of the Federalist Party, and Rhode Islanders were the last holdouts to join the Union of the original 13 colonies. Finally, on May 29, 1790, here in Newport, when a state convention narrowly voted to ratify the U.S. Constitution, Barton was given the signal honor of taking this news to President Washington in New York City. Here's an image of Barton and his sword, and that hangs on the Rhode Island Historical Society. Now, after the war, many Continental officers returned to their professions, a merchant, a lawyer, successful farmers. Barton had been a hatter prior to the war, and he didn't want to return to that, now that he was a colonel and a war hero. But he never found wealth as a real estate speculator, and he struggled with money to support his large family. He was appointed to the top federal post in the state, the tax collector for the Port of Providence, but he still had trouble supporting his family. Now, Rhode Island's post-war economy suffered. No news there. Many of its residents emigrated to frontier lands in the Midwest, upstate New York and Vermont. Barton led a group of Providence men to obtain a grant of land from the state of Vermont for undeveloped land in the northeast part of the state. His cause was helped along by Vermont legislature, which a powerful member was Ira Allen. And you might remember he was a brother of Ethan Allen, and Ira was very pleased that Barton had captured the hated Prescott. The Vermont legislature in 1781 did grant the lands to Barton and his group, and the village that arose would be named Barton, and it still is. Now, a small amount of taxes was imposed on the land that was allotted to the founders to help pay for surveying and marketing and other costs. Ira Allen was granted 18 lots, but he failed to pay his share of the taxes. Barton had that land sold at a land sale, tax sale, and Barton purchased the land that had been forfeited by Allen. So, not very good political situation, because Ira Allen was still a powerful man in Vermont politics. Barton then sold Allen's former land to some homesteaders, and those homesteaders started to create farms. But soon Ira Allen's successors brought a suit against the new owners to eject them, and against Barton. The legal history was a tangled one, to say the least. After more than 15 years of litigation, a judge declared in 1810 that the old gentleman should be perplexed no longer, and he ruled in favor of Barton. That seemed to settle it. But somehow in 1811, remember the suit was started in 1791, the chief judge of Vermont Supreme Court reopened the case and ruled against Barton, requiring Barton to pay $600. This Barton refused to do, and in September 1812 he was thrown in debtor's prison in Danville, Vermont. Now, in those debtors, a debtor could be forced to stay in prison until he paid his debts. What usually happened was there was no way to get a fresh start as there is now. What usually happened was their friends and family would help to pay, the creditor would reduce the amount a little bit. But Barton refused to allow any of his family or friends to pay. It was a matter of honor to him, and he would not pay the damages, and he would not let his friends pay either. However, Barton was allowed to stay at an inn in Danville, Vermont. So he didn't actually stay in a jail, he could hang out at this inn in Danville, Vermont. Barton spent years trying to get someone to pay his debts. He wrote to the Vermont legislature, the U.S. Congress, and even to President James Monroe, but all to no avail. In an 1820 letter to his father, Barton's devoted son, John B. Barton, expressed the family's frustration and sadness over Barton's continued absence. "I would say something to you on the subject of your return to Providence, but what can I say that I have not already said?" he wrote. "I pray you once more to return to the bosom of your family, and sure and certain I am that your staying in Vermont will answer no good purpose. And I pray you to consider what must be the feelings of your family were you to be called from this world while absent from them." But like so many other appeals, this one didn't succeed. But this letter clearly indicates that Barton, on his own accord, was staying and remaining in this predicament. Meanwhile, back in Rhode Island, Barton's wife, Rhoda, was getting older. Two of their sons passed away. His old war buddies started passing away. Why did Barton sacrifice so much for the sake of a few debts? It seems that the awards and fame bestowed on him for his capture of General Prescott swelled his sense of pride. Before, he had just been a hatter, and now after the capture of Prescott, he was a hero, raised to a colonel. He became a major general of the state militia, all because of this act. And now he would not stoop to Vermont applying its unjust laws. Now, beginning in 1821, sympathetic reports of Barton's plight began circulating in newspapers around the country. Most couldn't believe that a war hero was stuck in debtor's prison. Finally, fate intervened. Does anyone know who this is?
Lafayette.
Lafayette. Who said that? Raise your hand. Well done. most of my lectures, people don't get it. So, in 1824-25, Lafayette came on a triumphal tour of the United States. He visited every state, including Rhode Island, and he was very beloved. He heard of Barton's imprisonment for debt when he visited Providence in August of 1824 and when he visited Vermont in 1825. Barton had known Lafayette personally during the Rhode Island campaign in 1778. And in one of his last acts before returning to France, Lafayette generously wrote a check to pay the sums which Barton owed. Now the big question was, would Barton accept this generosity? Because he had said, I'm not going to let my family or friends. So everyone heard about it before Barton did, so they were all waiting on the stoop of the inn for news of Barton getting the news and what he would do. And he was told about Lafayette paying it, and he agreed that would settle the debt. So he agreed to go back home after 13 years in debtor's prison. Now, a man who rode with Barton in a carriage to Providence, Rhode Island, described the old soldier's return to his native city and home. Barton seemed a bit like Rip Van Winkle, who awoke after sleeping for 20 years. It seemed to astonish the old general to see the great alterations on the road as we approached Providence, and when he spoke of the Marquis, as he always calls Lafayette, his eyes filled with tears and gratitude. He had been a very powerful man and retains now, in the 77th year of his age, much of the vigor of his younger days. He would often sing a few lines of an old revolutionary song with a clear and strong voice. But when the old general entered his ancient home and embraced the wife of his youth, his children and his children's children, it was a scene which I cannot attempt to describe. They were all overjoyed and melted into tears. So Barton was finally reunited with his Providence home with his wife Rhoda and the rest of his surviving family. Rhode Islanders were also thrilled to have him back. He was one of the oldest surviving Revolutionary War veterans. On July 10, 1826, he led a procession of notables through Providence honoring the deaths of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, both who had passed away 6 days earlier on July 4th. Barton enjoyed the following July 4th visiting the now famous Overing House, where he had captured General Prescott 49 years earlier. And there's the Prescott House. Lauded as a hero for the remainder of his days, Barton died on October 22nd, 1831, at the age of 83. By the time of his death, Barton's daring capture of Prescott had become a nationally honored event. There would be books of famous American stories, and Prescott's raid would always be mentioned and described. But with the coming of the Civil War and the countless incidents of bravery and horror associated with that national conflict, Barton's legendary capture of Prescott began to fade from public consciousness. I hope I have played a part in bringing back to prominence William Barton as a hero of the Revolutionary War. Thank you. Be glad to take any questions.
Are you aware of any involvement by the French Major Louis Toussard during this raid?
No, I don't believe he was. That Toussard was came with D'Estaing during the Rhode Island campaign of 1778. So I don't think he was here yet. Toussard lost his arm in the Battle of Rhode Island, of course, so that was a tragedy. But he survived and continued. This is the Overing House, now known as the Overing-Nichols House. It's part of Prescott Farm, so we're up on West Main Road. The house is actually in Portsmouth, but the Prescott Farm Park is in Middletown. So, but still looks very much like it did back then. So it's nice to have that. The house is rented by the Newport Restoration Foundation, so you shouldn't go in looking for a tour. Although I did knock on the door of the gentleman who was there and see if I could get in, but he wasn't around. Prescott was captured in that room right there. So, any questions? Well, thank you very much, and I'd be glad to sign any books you'd be interested in purchasing. Thank you.
One last question.
Sorry.
What happened to Lee's dog?
Good question. He was lost. He was lost, and there was an advertisement put out, and Lee tried to get it back, but there's no record of him being found again, so sad. Yeah, Spado. Thank you. Thank you very much for attending.
Before you go, I just want to point out, when he said you can check the notes, I mean, you can read the book, but you can also just look at the notes, which are a book unto themselves. So it's quite prolific in the notes. So, but next time, We'll meet on the 13th, private anti-piracy navies and how the warships for hire are changing maritime security. Hope to see you then. Thank you.
Thank you.